Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to Unveiling Defense, Transparency, and Accountability in Global Arms. I am Dan Auble, a senior researcher here at OpenSecrets. Most of you are probably familiar with OpenSecrets, but if not, we are the premier money and politics data organization in the US. We are nonprofit and nonpartisan, and generally speaking, we collect a lot of money in politics data ranging from lobbying to campaign contributions, including dark money and outside money. We look at the revolving door, and we do those things at both the state and federal level. But the purpose of today's program specifically is to highlight some of the problems in reporting, disclosure, transparency, and accountability around US military spending and arms sales. We'll hear hopefully why that's important and maybe hear a few ideas how the system could be improved. Today's program is just one part of a multi-year project here at OpenSecrets, thanks to the generous funding of the Carnegie Corporation of New York, aimed at illustrating the political influence of the defense industry. So I encourage you to follow us for more on these topics. I'll also add some links in the chat of the work we and our speakers today have done as we go along. But just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. We are recording this session, and that recording will be made available after we conclude. And there also will be time for questions at the end. So please add your questions for our panelists using the Q&A feature, and we'll get to those at the end. So without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce you to our all-star panel of experts. First, we have Elias Yousif, who is a research analyst with the Stimson Center's Conventional Defense Program. There, his research focuses on the global arms trade and arms control, issues related to remote warfare and use of force, and international security cooperation and child soldier prevention. Ari Tolany is the director of the Security Assistance Monitor program at the Center for International Policy, which is an invaluable source of data on the sale and transfer of arms abroad. Savannah Wooten is the People Over Pentagon advocate at Public Citizen, where she manages a coalition to reduce military spending and reinvest in urgent human needs priorities. And with that, I think I'll hand it off to you, Elias, to share your thoughts.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Dan, and a big thanks to OpenSecrets for hosting today's event. I think all too often, and I think Ari and Savannah can speak to this, a lot of the conversations around transparency happen on the sidelines of broader discussions about individual policy choices or recipients. And so I'm very grateful to have the dedicated opportunity to discuss this important topic, hopefully in some greater detail. As Dan said, my name is Elias Yousif. I am with the Stimson Center's Conventional Defense Program, which focuses on the inherent risks and potential harms associated with the global arms trade. I focus a lot on the policy and practice of U.S. arms transfers and military aid programs and their implications for peace, security, and civilian protection. It's very nice to be sat next to so many lovely experts who will be able to let us delve into some of the details and nuances of the global arms trade and transparency, its nexus with industry. But just to kick us off, I think what I'm going to do, if you'll allow me, is just to zoom out a little bit and take us back to the very beginning of the Biden administration. It was just a few months into his tenure when the president released a memo entitled Revitalizing America's Foreign Policy and National Security Workforce, Institutions, and Partnerships. A bit of a mouthful, but in the memo, President Biden was fairly unequivocal when he stated that in a democracy, and I quote, "The public deserves as much transparency as possible regarding the work of our national security institutions. The revitalization of our national security and foreign policy workforce requires a recommitment to the highest standards of transparency." And so you can imagine for many of us working on this issue, such a lofty memo really inspired some hope that we might be reaching a turning point after years of increasing opacity in U.S. arms transfers and military aid programs. That even if there were practical challenges to improving transparency, that there was at least renewed political conviction in the value of transparency for enabling a more responsible and effective approach to U.S. arms transfers and military aid programs. But as you can tell from the introduction and from the tenor of our conversation so far, very little has changed in the years since the publication of that memo. In some ways, it's gotten worse. And what to me is even more troubling than, let's say, the persistent lack of publicly available data or reporting on these programs is how frequently in both private and public settings, we are being asked by senior policymakers, why do you need this information? Why is this important? What is the value of engaging in this kind of transparency? And to be frank, it's been both shocking and disappointing to hear from an administration that really thinks of itself as deeply committed to democratic principles, this degree of skepticism to such a fundamental tenet of democratic governance. And so before we get into how we can improve transparency, what policy changes are needed to address the opacity of arms transfers and U.S. military aid programs, I think it's worth reminding ourselves why transparency is important generally, but uniquely important for this enterprise. As some of you may know, the United States is by far and away the largest player in the global arms market. Ari will correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the United States makes up around 42%, right around that of the, thank you, Ari, of the international arms market. It is several times more than its next closest competitor and more than several of its competitors combined. And these are not ordinary commodities, obviously. Exporting the means of violence has profound implications for international security, for armed conflict, for governance, and obviously for civilian protection. And so given these weighty consequences, a lack of transparency, it certainly creates ethical dilemmas, but it also creates dilemmas of policy. And I think for researchers such as myself, the one that I'll start with, and I always start with, is that by siloing security cooperation information within these increasingly narrow government corridors, you dramatically limit the ability of various stakeholders to ensure that their expertise, that their equities and preferences are reflected in U.S. arms transfers decisions and approaches. And in effect, it becomes impossible for experts, lawmakers, and even interagency partners who may not have as direct access to the information to engage thoughtfully in shaping the enterprise, enriching the efficacy of our approaches, or in understanding the impact of what arms transfers do on the ground, or for U.S. foreign policy for that matter. And as you might imagine, in this context, security cooperation policy is uniquely susceptible to groupthink, to institutional biases, and other inefficiencies that warp risk calculations, warp the perception of priorities and interests, and I think in many ways enable short-sighted defense choices that maybe meet immediate expediencies, but often come at the expense of broader U.S. interests or long-term U.S. interests. And I honestly think it goes a long way to explaining why we so frequently find that our security cooperation policies have implicated the United States in predatory or abusive security partners or very weak states. And if I can digress just a bit here, I think the practice of U.S. arms transfers and military aid programs as an instrument of foreign policy is in desperate need of more in-depth research. It lags behind many of its peers in other sort of sectors for kind of in-depth academic research, and far too often our approaches are based on faith, on assumptions, rather than on evidence. And I think the frequent failures, in some cases dramatic failures of our security partnerships, is indicative of this shortcoming. And unsurprisingly, in this environment, in this sort of opaque environment, effective oversight becomes exceedingly difficult. And although Congress is enshrined in law as a key arbiter of U.S. security cooperation and assistance, that lack of transparency really contributes to its effective sidelining in many of the key arms transfers decisions that we've seen over the past several decades. And I think, moreover, without public transparency as a component to that, it becomes impossible for civil society to help focus attention of the divided attention of lawmakers on these issues and to sustain political interest and political pressure for stronger oversight and accountability. And lastly, as we all know, it is in secret when some of the worst human rights abuses occur, and where U.S. complicity in civilian harm via its support for predatory governments has been most acute historically. And as events over the past several years, and certainly over the last several months have shown, rhetorical commitments to human rights are not a sufficient safeguard against poor human rights practices in our arms transfers. All too frequently, the United States has been very willing to make compromises of its supposed values for the sake of preserving security partnerships. And I think that becomes a lot easier when those compromises take place in obscurity and are shielded from the political costs that those choices should merit. But conversely, just as a lack of transparency adds to the risks inherent in arms transfers, I think it's really important to highlight that embracing transparency as an ethos has important benefits for security cooperation and assistance. So in contrast to the current paradigm where this is very siloed approaches, transparency enables more effective interdisciplinary engagement on security cooperation. It facilitates the kind of research I was talking about, the kind of insight and analysis from think tanks, from academic institutions, the private sector, other civil society organizations, and other outside stakeholders that can aid in an effective evidence-based feedback loop, let's say, to improve the efficacy and responsibility of U.S. arms transfer policies. And transparency also enables effective and informed oversight from legislators, as envisioned in U.S. law. I think sometimes we hear from policymakers that oversight from Congress seems not well suited for the kind of complexity of the challenges at hand, but especially for overworked staffers who have numerous competing responsibilities, allowing public transparency in addition to sort of maybe the protected conversations being had between the executive branch and the Hill allows civil society to act as a force multiplier for the Hill, easing the burden on congressional offices, facilitating insights analysis that can contribute to more efficient, contextually rich and meaningful congressional oversight. And of course, vitally, public transparency ensures that arms transfers and the decisions around arms transfer that surrender values for other imperatives, short-term interests, are made with commensurate political costs, hopefully incentivizing more careful consideration in our arms transfer choices and elevating the judiciousness of our security cooperation practice. I think really importantly, transparency enables civil society, individuals and organizations like the one represented on this call to act as guardians of ethical U.S. foreign policy. And so, certainly while the absence of transparency aggravates the inherent risks of arms transfers, I think it's important to highlight how its presence has notable benefits, both in sort of the ethical and human rights space. It certainly is important for sustaining accountability, oversight, for guarding against irresponsible arms transfers. But if there are government folks in the room or someone who might hear this at some point, transparency can also improve the fundamental practice of U.S. security cooperation and making it a more effective instrument of U.S. foreign policy, in addition to making it more responsible. I'm going to stop there for the sake of time, and I'll pass to the fellow panelists. But I'll just quickly say that while improving transparency, I recognize will require significant political will, changes in political dynamics. I think in practice, there's plenty of low-hanging fruit that's very desperate to be picked, if you will. So whether that's improving the quality and detail of, let's say, congressional budget requests, simply not raising notification thresholds, which are the value at which Congress is informed of an arms sale, and we can talk about that in detail during the Q&A. Disaggregating existing public reports or simply reverting back to past practices when they were better. I think these are all steps the administration could take in the short term to match the promises of its 2021 memorandum. I'd love to dig into that a little bit more in the Q&A, but with that, Dan, I'll hand back to you. We can hear from others.
Excellent, thank you. That was a very good overview of why this is so important. Next, we'll hear from Ari.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dan, and thank you so much, OpenSecrets, for hosting. So my name is Ari Tolany. I'm the director of the Security Assistance Monitor at Center for International Policy, which is a clearinghouse that tracks and analyzes data around US security assistance and cooperation, as well as advocates for greater transparency and public reporting. And I will also just quickly note that our site is undergoing some back-end repairs right now. So anybody who is clicking to the site and noticing some broken links or data, we are aware of that and we are working on it. And I look forward to the Security Assistance Monitor returning as an even more robust form shortly once we've finished those data repairs. So I want to take us quickly through by kind of hitting some of those same notes Elias did. Why does this matter? And then also pulling out why some of this data is so important, because arms sales can tell us a lot of different things and be useful for a lot of different types of researchers, whether you're a PhD or you're somebody who's trying to figure out why your member of Congress is putting so much money into some arms sale that does not seem to be benefiting your district. Then I'm going to talk about two kind of points and places where I think we can improve. One is the congressional notification system, to which Elias just alluded, and the other is the poorly named end use monitoring, which is meant to tell us what happens to US munitions after they are sold or transferred. So I do just kind of want to return to the point that Elias made, which is that the United States controls 42% of the global market share of arms. We are the world's #1 arms dealer. That is what it is, and that is why our practices have so much knock-on effects in other states, and why the volume that we sell makes it so important that we have good transparency and robust data, which frankly, at the moment, we don't. So I know we hear a lot about how China and Russia and other places are increasing their arms markets or increasing their military spending. And I think it's really important to put those figures in perspective. So the United States sells 282% more than France, which is the #2 arms dealer in the world. In fact, we sell more weapons than France, China, Russia, and Germany combined. So those are the next 4. So when we talk about the scale and the impact of US sales, we are really looking at something that is unrivaled in the world. The other thing that this means is because there is such a huge volume of sales coming out, the way that many, many people throughout the world interact with the United States is not through a new Beyonce album or even through the delivery of a USAID food parcel. It is at the barrel of a gun. And so being cognizant that this is the way that so many people throughout the world interact with the United States and understand the United States' role is really important to having such good transparency and to seeing what we can do better to better understand and reframe so that we're not just reinvesting into these militaristic solutions, which we know don't work. I'll also note that the most sort of reliable recipients of US security assistance, so these are the countries or states that receive the most amount of money, are not those with entirely unproblematic human rights records. So we give a lot of money to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, many of munitions which were used in its war in Yemen, where there were many violations of international humanitarian law, likely amounting to war crimes. We fund Qatar with its many internal human rights abuses. And as has come very much into the public cognizance in recent months, we send billions and billions of dollars of money and weapons to Israel. And so we are seeing sort of being able to track and understand where all of these transfers and sales happen, kind of give us a little bit of insight both into how the United States is prioritizing and thinking about its policy. But as OpenSecrets has so carefully sort of tracked and monitored, we also see the corruption, the graft, and the sort of palm greasing that funds a lot of these transactions. So when you go into the OpenSecrets database and you look up foreign lobbyists, or you look up the defense industry, and I'll note that the defense industry is a convenient euphemism. I prefer to use arms dealers. But when you look at any of these industries, you see massive amounts of money donated in congressional races, you see PACs form. And so one of the reasons I would argue is that we have insufficient transparency is because of this influence of money in politics, and because it is in the interest of arms dealers, it is in the interests of foreign states to obscure and make it difficult for citizens and taxpayers to understand what their money is really going towards. And so that's just kind of an overall plug for why transparency is so important. I want to get a little bit more into some of the things that arms sales can tell us, because they can be really interesting sources of data. And I think the work that we do of kind of collecting on one end really helps our partners throughout the world. So for example, when internally displaced people in the Jabalia refugee camp in Palestine were bombed. They found fragments of a GBU-39, so that's a guided bomb unit. They found cage codes from Boeing. It was actually made in Texas, my home state. And so we are able to link what people are experiencing, the harms that people may be experiencing, and link it back to US sales, which from a legal perspective is really important in establishing a credible chain for aiding and abetting. So for example, the current court case, Defense of Children International Palestine versus Biden, where a group of lawyers and advocates are suing the Biden administration for their continued provision of weapons to Israel in light of the International Court of Justice's provisional measures. Providing proof of where these weapons are coming from, whether it's photos from locals on the ground that we can then link to specific shipments, is incredibly useful in establishing kind of a chain. The other thing that this gives us is it gives us a lot of insight into diversion. And I hope it doesn't sound like I'm picking on one country in particular, but I am going to talk a little bit about the United Arab Emirates, because this is one that has had a lot of really interesting sales and a lot of diversions, and I think really picks up some of the interesting aspects around money in politics and the influence of foreign lobbies. So in the 2010s, we transferred, and by the way, when I say we, I do not mean myself, the Security Assistance Monitor, I mean the United States government, but the United States government transferred a large amount of mine resistance ambush protected vehicles to the United Arab Emirates. They disappeared for a couple of years, and then they popped up in 2017 in the hands of the Giants Brigade, which is an Al-Qaeda affiliate in Yemen. So when we're talking about the harms that the arms trade can cause or the ways that arms can appear, we're not just talking about the use in a way that we do not like by the intended recipient. We're also talking about transfer and diversion. So not just, the Saudis used a Raytheon-made bomb to hit a school bus in Yemen. I think that is damaging for the United States. I think it is damaging for the Yemeni people. And I think being able to track and understand that is incredibly important. Beyond that, the transfers to states, which then transfer beyond or lead to weapons diversion or the proliferation of conventional arms, is something that's really concerning and it's worth keeping an eye on. And I'll highlight again, looking at the UAE right now, the Yale Humanitarian Lab and the Small Arms Survey have recently published some very credible reporting showing the United Arab Emirates has supplied weaponry, including United States origin weaponry, to the Rapid Support Forces, which are the militias that are currently engaged in ethnic cleansing in Sudan and have currently encircled the city of El Fasher, where crimes against humanity are occurring and the situation is really, really dire. And that it should be getting much more global attention and much more political pressure than it is. We know that the United Arab Emirates have repeatedly transferred munitions that they were sent to these militias. Yet perhaps because of the UAE's presence in Washington, their ability to maintain powerful lobbying firms, their ability to influence, their ability to send in lobbyists to influence questions around transparency, we have seen very little public discourse outside of some legislation introduced by Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs, which deliberately targets this link, about the diversion and retransfer of weapons into conflict zones by one of the United States' most key partners. And so this is another example of sort of these gaps of transparency make us lose a critical chain in the kind of the conflict piece, where we can't always, where these weapons and these munitions drive incredible conflict and civilian harm, and being able to trace and accurately understand who is providing them and who the middleman is something that is really important. So I'm then going to take us into a couple of things that I think we can do about this. So the first is the congressional notification system, which I think is one of our big gaps. So a lot of the time, most of the arms sales that we find out about are through the congressional notification system. So for close US allies and partners like NATO, South Korea, Israel, and others, for any sale over $25 million for major defense equipment, for defense articles, it's $100 million. A notification must be transmitted to Congress. And that's how we find out about a lot of these big ticket sales. I'll note that for less close partners, those not in NATO or with a major non-NATO ally, those are lower notifications. So $14 million for major defense equipment and $50 million for defense articles and services. What you are probably thinking is, what about all of the stuff that goes through under that? And the answer is there is a lot, and it is very hard to keep track of. So that is one of our biggest gaps in data, is how That is one of our biggest data gaps, is all of the sales that are occurring under the congressional notification threshold. And I think for an example of kind of how much we may be missing, there was a Government Accountability Office report, so from the US Department of State itself, that acknowledged that from 2017 to 2022, there were $11 billion in sales that went through under the congressional notification threshold to the United Arab Emirates and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia as they conducted their war in Yemen. So that's just a big picture. $11 billion is a lot. And that's sort of the pictures that we're missing. And I'll note that this is particularly high risk for some types of munitions. You know, guns cost a couple $1,000s. So we can see the flow of incredibly dangerous defense articles and services, and particularly conventional weapons under these notification thresholds. And I'll also note that there have been several efforts, lobbyist-backed in Congress, to raise these notifications even further so that we would miss a bigger portion than what we do. And there's a brief in the chat from my colleagues from Women for Weapons Trade Transparency on that issue. So congressional notifications, I would say the more insight we can get into those, the better. The lower those thresholds can be made, the better, because that is really our most robust source of data, and it's important that we maintain and expand that. The other thing that I'll talk about is end-use monitoring, which is kind of an unfortunate misnomer. And I'll also note that that brief is in the chat as well. So end-use monitoring is sort of meant to be an understanding of how US defense articles and services are used. However, this is on kind of an outdated Cold War framework. And so it's really based on kind of calling somebody up, your partner in the Security Cooperation Office in another state, and making sure that the weapon you sold is where it is supposed to be. I will note that we do not do this terribly well. These are under-resourced and understaffed programs. We miss a whole lot, which is how key security partners like the United Arab Emirates can continue to supply weapons to al-Qaeda-linked groups with very little impunity or accountability. But the other thing that's really important about this is that end-use monitoring does not actually track use. So in terms of, I wouldn't call this low-hanging fruit, I would call this medium to high-hanging fruit perhaps, but in terms of reforms that we should be looking for, I think that conditions around international humanitarian law and agreeing to use munitions in a way that is compatible with international human rights and humanitarian law should be built into terms conditions. And the Arms Export Control Act, which establishes the statutory mandate for end-use monitoring, should be modified or amended to explicitly state that we are tracking and interested in violations of end-use monitoring. This is a real issue when we are relying on civil society and open source research, for example, to figure out that a GBU-39 that struck a refugee camp was US in origin, when there are significant resources that the United States government could be implementing to allow this, and consequently to create greater accountability in our arms sales. I think that's all I will speak on. I'm happy to answer any questions or talk about any of that in more detail, and I'll turn it back over to our moderator.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I'll just make a reminder here to put any questions you may have in the Q&A, the Zoom feature Q&A. And with that, I'll hand it off to you, Savannah.
Great, thank you. And I'll start up top by saying I do not work as centrally on arms trade issues, and so it's been so helpful actually for me to be on here and learning alongside everyone as well. I think Dan introduced me at the beginning, but I will reintroduce for those of you who have hopped on. I'm Savannah Wooten. I work with Public Citizen here in DC. I work on our Pentagon spending reduction portfolio. So we've got a coalition of groups and advocates who talk broadly around how large the Pentagon budget is, you know, the myriad of reasons why that number has been ballooning in our lifetimes. And we talk about ways that we can address different components of the military industrial complex process to bring that number down in a discerning way. So I am going to do a little bit of the zoom out on this webinar, step away from the arms component and talk just in general about this massive budget we have as the United States, how and why it's sustained, and how some of the transparency and reporting that those of us on this call do can really impact our ability as citizens to tackle or understand that number. So I don't think we can have a conversation about defense spending in the United States, and particularly transparency, without talking about just what the size of that budget is. And every time, if we had this, in 5 months, 6 months, the number would be going up. Throughout the entire year, the budget process seems to be constantly ongoing, from the president's request at the beginning of a calendar year, naming what the budget will be for all different federal agencies for the next fiscal year. And then Congress goes through its process of marking up the different elements of that budget, negotiating on the numbers of what to authorize and what to appropriate. And then it's been different timing, in the last handful of years, but sometime toward the middle or the close of the year, we settle on a number, and then the process starts again. And so the number that was requested for FY, so fiscal year 25, which is what the budget that Congress is currently working on for the Pentagon, which is the defense spending side of the budget, the request was $895 billion. So I'm in the same hand as Ari in terms of not wanting to always call that defense spending. I think it's a little bit of a misnomer. We spend on a variety of things that I think people could argue are not, quintessential to defending the country, and that there are, a handful of things that, would be investments in human security that would maybe make us more secure. But using that framework, $895 billion is an astonishing amount, and one that I think when we talk about it at Public Citizen, we try to make that, a kitchen table conversation, and we simply just, as human beings, don't have a frame of reference for what $895 billion looks like. But we're rapidly hurtling towards $1 trillion. That will be an unprecedented number in the next few years to be spending on weapons, war, waste. We would include in that category in terms of the way that the Pentagon spends. And people have really had a watchful eye on it, despite all of the upward pressure to keep that number ballooning. So in recent years, just to give you an idea of how rapidly that's increasing, other budgets are going up by, relative percentage points. The Pentagon budget has been going up by tens of billions of dollars every single year. It is one of the areas that tends to be least contested in terms of excess spending, although there are great advocates trying to push back on that. In terms of being able to share some of that information with people that we often reference the fact that the U.S. military spends 9 times or more than the next 9 countries combined. So if you sum up, global military spending, we are just like an astonishing player. I think in the same way that Ari and Elias were talking about us making up 42% of arms sales, we also make up a whopping massive amount of global military spending. And then if you bring that down to a U.S. context, if you take every other federal agency and you sum up all the different budgets, so you think Interior, you think Department of State, you think Treasury, all of these different departments, and sum them up, the Pentagon budget dwarfs them and includes them. So if that is giving you a conception of where your taxpayer dollars are, that is why many of us see that as one of the most important places to zero in on how that spending is being spent. And just another fact on that front, we spend half of our discretionary spending every year as a country on Pentagon spending specifically. So that excludes programs like Medicare and Social Security. But outside of that, 50% of our national spending is going to the Pentagon every year. So there's a variety of ways that this number and this type of prolific spending is being locked in. We as a community, summarize that as the military-industrial complex. In recent years, there have been some pushes to actually add a word and call that the military-industrial congressional complex, because if you did not have, congressional sign-off or Congress acting as the purse strings, as they are designed to be, you would not have the, proliferation of this budget every single year. But for the sake of time, I'm just going to highlight a few different ways, but this is a very savvy system, right? There's not just one way that defense contractors or Pentagon, actors are securing this funding. It's coming from a lot of different angles by design, which makes it very tricky to assess as outside advocates. So some of the ways that, this system works, defense contractors, notably, before I even go into some of the mechanisms, defense contractors get about half of the Pentagon budget every year. So if you're thinking just like doing the math that I'm giving you substantively, if we have an $895 $1 billion budget, and then, you know, that's roughly half of our US discretionary spending, and then half of that $895 billion is going to defense contractors. That's just a shocking amount of what we pay in taxes. It's going directly to defense contractors every year. And so those defense contractors have a very invested interest in continuing that stream of funding. And so, you know, within that half of the budget that they are getting, you know, year after year, there are a lot of different mechanisms. Campaign contributions to members of Congress are one of the ways. So they'll look, you know, I don't think any member of Congress is exempt, but there are members of Congress that are, you know, more inclined to be targeted if they are on specific spending committees that are relevant. So I know the House Armed Services and Senate Armed Services committees, and also the appropriations committees, if members of the House or Senate are serving on these committees, they tend to be more heavily targeted by you know, defense contributions to their campaigns, kind of underscoring, you know, we are invested in you continuing to hold this position, and therefore you know, kind of the tacit implication is you know, investing in our companies through defense contracts. Another way is lobbying efforts. So you know, one thing is that campaign contributions people will immediately think about as one of the first, you know, ways that the military industrial complex takes hold, but there are upward caps on campaign contributions. And so another way that the influence is distributed or used is through direct lobbying. So, you know, if you are a representative of a company like Lockheed, Raytheon, Boeing, and you have an invested interest in your particular weapon system, you know, being built in a district, or, you know, getting a renewed contract, there are specific lobbyists for these companies that will go in literally physically to the Hill and will make the case for the continuation of these programs year after year. So direct lobbying is another one. The revolving door, which I imagine, since we have an Open Secrets audience, this will be a familiar term, but for those who that might be new to, this is the idea that Pentagon officials who have retired or have had some sort of, you know, insider knowledge about the way that these contracts are given, when their time at the Pentagon is up or they transition out of industry, there's a, you know, a brief, you know, holdover period, but then they will join industry itself and use their information that they had from working at the Pentagon or working on defense contracts to then secure additional contracts. And so you often get, you know, the 4-stars who, you know, had some sort of influential position in the military itself, then moving into advising capacities, being on boards of these companies, even heading up specific new projects because they know, you know, an example we've been looking at a lot at Public Citizen is like AI, right? The Pentagon has been saying AI is going to be massively influential. We're going to need to, you know, basically AI the military. We're going to need to, you know, get all of these systems in place, get AI officers, have even weapon systems that, you know, use autonomous information systems. And so then you'll get people who know that that's the next big wave of investment. They'll go out and they'll work for, you know, a Silicon Valley AI firm, and then like have insider knowledge about how to secure those contracts. So it's a, you know, a complex system, but you get people who have information about how to work this system, get these types of, you know, millions and billions of dollar contracts, and then they go out and make sure that external companies secure them. So that's a huge one we track. And then the other one, which I think is well known, but it is particularly difficult to map out, literally map, is the idea that some of these systems would be produced with a specific part or a specific element in different key congressional districts, then making those members of Congress really indebted to or wedded to that specific program. So we've seen that in recent years where people will advocate for, you know, something like the F-35 plane or a specific, you know, warship that, you know, naval officers have been saying, you know, we need to retire this, but because it's located in a specific district, or because, you know, this wing part is so essential because there's a manufacturing facility in X location, then you get a particular member of Congress who will say, you know, in general, I'm all in favor of cutting these, you know, systems we don't need anymore, or, you know, finding areas where we could reduce costs on production, but I really don't want to, you know, cut this particular program because it's in my district and, you know, I have people who are employed by it. And so by design, I think there have been some really ambitious mapping projects, but it's done in a way that makes it difficult for advocates to keep up. But you can kind of overlay where some of these things are produced and then see why, you know, they develop specific champions in Congress who will make sure that those programs get funded year after year. So if you think about combining all of those different almost tentacles, not to use something that's massively nefarious, but tentacles of influence, right? Then you can kind of see how the system of spending on weapons, war, just national, defense writ large, as the term that most folks will use for it, is embedded and can continue basically on its own accord, right? You have people who are individual actors in all of these different areas, but it makes sure that the money keeps flowing year after year. So that is a broader overview, and I'm happy to answer questions. I think we could do a webinar on literally any one of those particular, elements of the military industrial complex, and simply don't have time. Something that I was hoping to highlight is just, I know we're also thinking about, as people who are concerned about this issue, what are some of the things that are being done? How can we streamline? How can we tackle this? And so I'm going to close this out by just sharing some of the suggested reforms or things that we have seen in recent years that give us some, optimism or some, interest in seeing some of these loopholes close. There's a variety of them, and as you can imagine, pushing for them is a bit of an uphill battle in Congress itself. But you have seen people really latching onto some of these reforms and trying to push them uphill, as it were. So a few of those, there have been members of Congress in the last, I think, 4 years who have been introducing cuts amendments to the Pentagon budget writ large. And that's been an exciting and interesting thing. We have not seen that, longer than the last 5 years. It's a newer development, but there have been, researchers who have been identifying, to use low-hanging fruit, which I think we've now all said, but low-hanging fruit in the budget, where, this particular system is known to be faulty, or this particular contract, if there were better guardrails on it, we'd be able to save billions of dollars. And so because some of that work has been done, there have been a lot of outside panels or groups, and I'm happy to send along some of these links where people have identified, oh, we could easily, cut or, recoup $50 billion by reforming this contract in this way. Or, if we, retired a specific weapon system, here's what the cost savings would be. And so Representatives Pocan and Lee have taken a look at some of those particular suggestions for how to reduce and reinvest the Pentagon budget, and have come in with proposals to cut. And so that's been really interesting. We have seen them, some years those get votes, some years they don't. It's really largely dependent on the political situation in Congress at the time, in terms of if those are getting airtime to be discussed or, to add an opinion taken on them. But we've seen efforts like that, just to say writ large, this budget can come down. It's up to the Pentagon to determine where it would come. 100 billion is the number that Pocan and Lee have been using in recent years, but saying of 895 billion, that amount can come down. It's up to the Pentagon to determine where it would make those cuts, but we know for a fact we could do it. And so there have been interesting efforts along those fronts we've been supportive of. For the people who have wanted real precision on where those cuts could come from, there have been a few CBOs, the Congressional Budget Office reports, that will map out, if we were to cut 100 billion, across the budget for the next 10 years, what would that look like? How would it impact security? So people are doing the back end work. It's not just a random suggestion. There have been some projections out of what it would look like to cut the budget in that way. Another one is the audit the Pentagon reform. So this has been in the works for the last few years. It's one of the areas of reforms that has had bipartisan support, but this is a fun and a little dismal fact, which is that the Pentagon has been audited for the last 6 years, and it has not passed a single one of those audits. So, I mean, we, as a corporate watchdog group, flag that all the time. You can't think of a single corporate entity that, if it failed 6 audits in a row, would still be given billions and billions of dollars, much of which it has license to do highly classified things with, then is not, reported on or publicly available. And so there have been some reforms that would, if the Pentagon failed another audit, or I believe some of the text is, if specific departments of the Pentagon were failing their audits, they would receive financial deductions from the budget. And so that's a newer proposal, is that there would be a financial penalty to this massive spending entity if they were unable to track or account for their spending. So that would be a really great step forward, particularly as we were talking about transparency on this call. There have also been some really great efforts to get more clarity on pricing. So there are some almost comical examples of pricing at the Pentagon. If you only have this one particular contract, or this helmet can only be made by the the same company that produces the airplane that is flying it, then that helmet is, marked up to the tune of thousands and thousands of dollars more than it would need to be. And so there have been some interesting proposals in recent years on doing reports on the costs of things, or, making sure that, contracts that are groups that are doing contracting with the military are also held to fair pricing standards in the same way that basically the free market is running. And then finally, there's something called the unfunded priorities list. This, when I first heard about it, I was so surprised by it. It's functionally like a Pentagon Christmas list where they get the budget, requests from the Pentagon will collaborate with the president, right, to put out what their executive branch request for the Pentagon is each year, but then they immediately compile a list of things that, like, oh, this wasn't included this year, but if we had our way, we would want it. So it's literally a list that will say, this many planes, this much plus up for, R&D in this area, an extension of the life cycle of this program, right? The literal, written out list. And then they give that to Congress in a formal way. And then when Congress is inclined to bump up the budget, which does happen more often than not, they will use that list to then award more funding. And so it's a way, basically like a little bit of a pressure release valve where no other agency gets to do this. They don't get to outline, oh no, we didn't get what we wanted this year, please give us all these other things. But the Pentagon does have that. And so advocates who have been interested in tackling supersized Pentagon spending have also gone after that list, saying no other agency has that list. That requirement should be stripped. There's no reason why the Pentagon should do its budget process in a way that's different from other agencies. So that's really just a handful of a few things that people are working on. It's a ripe field. I think people feel that it's quite wonky and it's quite difficult to know where to start when you're talking about that size of amount of money and a very entrenched process for, this spending being secured every year. But when you zoom out and think about it from, a 10,000-foot level, it really is. This is a shocking amount of our taxpayer dollars that's going into this. It is not being spent in the most discerning way possible. If we had invested in, other human needs priorities, or if we were able to reclaim some of that money that's being spent in a wasteful, fraudulent, or just excessively militarized way, maybe we would, have, outcomes that would look different as a country. And so we try to encourage people to kind of step back and think of these reforms as a way to reallocate this funding in an aligned way. So I'll stop there. I know that we will have time for questions, but anything as it relates to the military industrial complex, Pentagon spending writ large, or if any of these particular reforms are of interest, happy to answer on those fronts as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So now we'll move on to questions. We have a few good ones here. First of all, just to reiterate, we are recording this and that will be made available, and we'll also share all the links that I put in the chat so people can digest that stuff on a longer timeline. Now, I'm not sure whether this is in any of your particular expertise, but one of our attendees is asking if there are laws prohibiting members of Congress to take foreign actors' money, and if not, why. I know there's a little bit of that I can speak to, or Savannah can speak to in the money and politics world, but I don't know if there are any other aspects or comments anyone would like to make.
I just note that OpenSecrets has a really great resource on this. I was actually about to drop it in the chat, but I'm not sure I can access everything. So I will just note the 10 things you don't know about money and politics is very helpful. The short answer is it is technically illegal for a foreign individual to donate directly to a campaign or effort. But given the massive amount of dark money and 501c4 donations, in practice, this can happen, just not in terms of direct individual contributions. And so I'll let Dan and Savannah, who work on these issues much more closely, answer that in more detail.
Yeah, Dan, I can follow you. I think I just have an asterisk to add.
Oh, sure. Well, Ari, you hit on the main items. Of course, foreign actors can't make direct contributions to campaigns or PACs, but this massive amount of dark money, which is money that essentially just blocks transparency of who initially gave the money. That money goes to nonprofits who then either can spend on campaigns themselves or give to super PACs, which are also allowed to accept unlimited amounts of money. And again, we kind of don't know what we don't know, but that is one avenue that could be exploited.
Yeah, and I can just add to that, because what I was thinking when I first heard that question was, similarly, yes, that's prohibited, but also there are a lot of ways that, money is spread around in maybe not so palatable ways. And I think one of the other things that we look at closely, even though it's not, direct donations from foreign actors, we just keep an eye on stock trading or stock holding by members of Congress. So I cannot speak to this in its fullest potential, but we've got a colleague of mine, Craig Holman, a public citizen, whose entire portfolio is on monitoring or trying to advocate for members of Congress not having a conflict of interest and having stock holdings in organizations or corporations that they will then directly benefit from. And so there have been some efforts in recent years to either just prevent members of Congress from holding stocks writ large while they're in office, which there's obviously been some pushback on, but is a strong idea. And then also just this year, there's been a more specific defense spending bill introduced on that front as well. Representative Rashida Tlaib of Michigan has introduced I believe it's Stop members of Congress from profiting from war law, and that would be a little more precise, saying essentially that members of Congress wouldn't be able to hold stock or trade stock in defense companies while they're in office. And so I think there's some focus on also going at it from a corporate angle too versus direct contributions.
And I would also mention the Foreign Agent Registration Act, which goes much beyond lobbying, but is essentially spending by foreign governments and political parties from around the globe to exert influence in the U.S. And that includes lobbying, but also big PR campaigns or op-eds and all kinds of meetings that they have, social media campaigns. So that, of course, is not illegal, but that's another source of information. And some of our research has found that countries spending tons of money that gets disclosed through that regime are also and they are specifically mentioning working on arms sales, and then they of course get huge arms sales. So the FARA stuff is important as well. To hit on the low-hanging fruit theme we have here, I wanted to ask both, what are some low-hanging fruit items that we could improve in the reporting? But also, what is the most important thing, and maybe each of you can speak to this, that even if it would require a much bigger lift, what do you think would have the most impact on the ground?
All right, that's a small question. Why don't you start so that I can piggyback off whatever you've...
Sounds like a plan. I think there are quite a few things that I would like to personally do. So I think maybe I'll just focus on one piece of legislation that has been introduced in the House and the Senate. And so that is the Armas Act, which is a very good acronym. As you may know, Armas means guns in Spanish. But so this is the America's Regional Monitoring of Arms Sales Act. This has been introduced in both the House and the Senate. And as I alluded to, guns and tracking the flow of firearms abroad is one of the things that we are just really ill-equipped as a sector to do, because congressional notifications are because guns rarely meet the congressional notification threshold, because they are very easy to transfer. So when you look at, for example, the gang crisis in Haiti, or the incredibly dangerous conflicts going on in the Northern Triangle and El Salvador, a lot of those are the result of the export of American guns. And so I think passing this act, which would both return a lot of transparency that we lost in the Trump administration to give greater oversight into what guns are being sold and to whom, as well as to disrupt trafficking and increase resourcing around monitoring and sales, is one really big thing that I would love to see. So I think passing the Artemis Act is a big thing. And then I'll also just note, as I alluded to, we have had efforts in the National Defense Authorization Act and annual appropriations. There are people in Congress who have tried to do the right thing and make it so that end use monitoring expands use. And we sort of hear that often those offices get visits from lobbyists or visits from various folks who would prefer the end use monitoring not have its remit expanded to more accurately track use. So I would really just point out that sunlight is the best disinfectant. If the United States is proud of a policy and it thinks it's doing the right thing, there should be no shame in having its taxpayers know about it. And so I think when we are seeing attacks on transparency or removal of transparency efforts, it can tell us a lot of the time that something's up. So pass Artemis and make end use monitoring monitor use.
Those are good. I would agree with all of that. Just for the sake of variety, I think a couple things that I would point to. So folks may know on the call, there are two basic ways that the United States provides military equipment and training abroad. One is through sales, so people are purchasing stuff. And then the other is through assistance, so stuff that the taxpayer is paying for that we give away to countries. I think something that I would really love to see, and this is in the low-hanging fruit category, the Department of Defense is required to produce a budget justification every year that details what it wants to do with its military aid. It's called Title 10 authorities. That budget justification is analytically not very useful. They aggregate various programs. There is very little detail, and in most cases, there isn't any country-level detail. For example, it'll say, combine 3 programs together, give you one big number, and there's no country associated with it. So I think maybe the lowest hanging fruit, because the DoD has this information. And in fact, in past practices and in past budget justifications, there's good examples of more detailed reporting. What I would love to see every single year would be a request that had the fiscal year that's being requested for, the program that's being requested for, the money that's being requested for, the recipient, and a description of what's being delivered or what's planned to be delivered. And I'd love to see what was actually spent in the previous year. This is something that the State Department does, by the way. It gives you, for its assistance programs, the actuals and estimated for previous fiscal years. The Department of Defense does not do that. This is just a formatting thing. This is something that the DoD could do very easily. In terms of maybe some higher fruit, the one place where we have the least amount of transparency is in commercial arms sales. And so people understand there are 2 types of arms sales that the United States conducts. One is foreign military sales, and these are sales between the United States government with another foreign recipient. And then there are sales that are managed and negotiated between a foreign recipient and directly with defense contractors and commercial actors that are licensed by the Department of State, but they have very little hand in those. We get to see publicly congressional notifications for government-to-government sales. We do not get that level of information for commercial sales. And commercial sales represent more of what we sell abroad every year than the government-to-government by a huge margin. I think, if I recall correctly, I think it's 60% more, or something like that. I mean, Ari, again, I trust Ari and the data experts there, but it's a huge percentage of our arms transfers that we have very little visibility into. We get some post-facto visibility through something called the 655 report, which is produced every year. It is consistently late. It's missing its statutorily required deadline. And the data has become, over the last several years, so aggregated that it's not analytically useful as a researcher, as an investigator, as a journalist. And so really what we need is public notification of commercial arms sales. I think those would be my number 1 and number 2 asks.
I know we're at time, so I can give mine in like a 2-second briefer because I want people to be able to get off. But I think I'll go like the less wonky and organizer perspective and say, I think the most helpful thing that we could possibly do in the next few years is get a strong contingent of people talking about, just from a constituent perspective, talking about and really in support of cuts and reforms. So I think, you know, tangibly, if I had to put my name on what I would like that to be, it would be something like the Poe-Canley People Over Pentagon Act, in that it demonstrates, you know, that this is an issue that has more salience with the broader population. It is something that people are paying more attention to, wanting to be more discerning about. I think building power specifically on, you know, bringing these things to light, and not, you know, basically, like, as a constituency, not allowing blank checks to be signed in our name to the Pentagon is the big thing we could do. So it's a big ask, but it would be, you know, putting individual pressure on members of Congress, or being supportive of that particular piece of legislation. You're muted, Dan.
We are at time. Thank you. There are a couple other questions, but I do want to mention that in addition to making the recording available, we are going to write kind of a summary and some takeaways piece, and hopefully maybe we can hit some of these questions in that. So keep an eye out for that on OpenSecrets.org. So I just want to thank all of our panelists for a great discussion. A lot of important information was shared, and thank you everyone who attended for attending.
Thanks,
Thank you for
everyone.
moderating, Dan. It's been a privilege to be invited. I know all of us feel that way.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Thanks, Open Secrets.
Thank you.